surround the children of Israel. And those are the peoples in the Egyptian form that the children of Israel came out of. And now Moses writes to give them God's perspective and a biblical and an inspired view of reality, so that they would have not only confidence as a people to know they're related to the God of creation, the God that spoke things into being, the God that shows his power, but they're going to also see God's power displayed as he leads them out of Egypt in the Exodus. And that's the background. So there's a lot of little hints in the book of Genesis, and particularly Genesis chapter 1, of this background. So it's good to understand that. Now, kind of by way of application, we come from a similar background. We come from a similar culture. We come from a similar idea. Today, the idea is more pantheistic rather than polytheistic, but the concept is still the same. We still do battle with those that believe in naturalism. In other words, nature is more prominent than God. In other words, nature is basically the end, and in our culture we call it science. So the science basically is prominent in our culture, has replaced the theologian as the authority of truth. So we go to the scientists today. So we're not any different. We're just a little bit more, I don't even know that we're even more sophisticated. We're just different, but not that much different from these peoples that Moses is addressing in the book of Genesis. So I see a polemic function as part of what Moses is accomplishing. And in the process of doing this, since the principles are the same and they are transcending time, they have impact on us as well. So Genesis 1 speaks to us in the culture in which we live in, because our culture is not that different from the culture that in terms of spirituality, in terms of that of the Israelites. So let's get into Genesis 1. I give you that background just to give you kind of the setting of the book and to see and make sense of some of the details that we will expound as we move further in the other months. But I hope that this impresses you with how important this book was to the children of Israel when they received it. And it also is equally important to us. So it's going to address issues much like what the children of Israel faced in terms of their culture. It's going to do the same in our culture. The issues today are related to science. And as we know, that's why we do creation science. Well, first of all, the opening verses are very, very simple. Even a child can understand them. So I am going to mess that whole idea up. Now, they are simple. If you read them, very straightforward, very simple, but yet there's a subtleness to them that makes them extremely complex and somewhat, maybe not difficult to understand the main themes, but in terms of some of the details. There's at least 3 major theories concerning the relationships that are presented in verses 1 through 3. And I presented the 3 major relationships on the back side of your outline sheet. And I'll go over that in some detail. And I hope I don't overwhelm you with some of the details here. But there are 3 basic theories, and there's modifications of just about every one of these, or not modifications, variations of each one of these. The first one is the original creation with an absolute beginning. Let me give you the details of that. And this gets down to the grammar. When you get down to the Hebrew grammar, it's not totally clear. It's not crystal clear. And there's some issues there. So this viewpoint, let's discuss it first of all. We'll call it the original creation. It goes by different words or different descriptions. It sees verse 1, and this has lots of reasons for its existence. In fact, it's an old viewpoint. Let me get to my notes in the right place here to make sure I've got everything straight. So it's also called the initial chaos theory. This would be the viewpoint where the original creation out of nothing, ex nihilo. That's verse 1. Verse 2 is where the problem comes. How does verse 2 fit in? We have three what are called in Hebrew circumstantial clauses, at least from this viewpoint. And I'll give you a translation here in a moment that would reflect this viewpoint. And these three clauses describe the conditions at that creation. In other words, as God created, these are the conditions that came out of that original creation. Does that make sense? It might make more sense as I contrast the other viewpoints. And then verse 3 through 21 are the creation details of how God went about to correct, or I don't want to use the word correct in this viewpoint because verse 2 is viewed in a neutral sense. Viewed in a neutral sense. The formless and void with no negative connotation, and even the darkness with no negative connotation under this viewpoint. Now, the other two viewpoints view them in a negative sense, and I'll give you the reasons for that in a moment. So that's the heart of this viewpoint. And this is the viewpoint, and this is on the back of your outline sheet there. To sketch it on a timeline, first of all, you would have the original creation, and that's out of nothing, ex nihilo, verse 1. And the conditions as God began to create are described in verse 2, not necessarily sequentially, but these are the conditions as God began to create. And then we have the six-day creation, verses 1 through 21, so that day 1 would begin at verse 1. Day 1 begins at verse 1. Now, the other viewpoints are different, as you'll notice as we move through them. Grammatically, verse 1 is viewed as an independent clause. Verse 2, related back to verse 1, conjunctive or with an and. And then we have the three circumstantial clauses connected with verse 1. And this would be translated in this way. Verse 1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, comma. That's the main clause. And then verse 2, and continuing, these modify verse 1. Does that make sense? And the earth was formless and void. And then we have the other two circumstantial clauses. And there was darkness over the deep, etc. And the Spirit of God, etc. Okay? And then, verse 3 is an independent clause. Then God said. And he begins to create. Does that make sense? Now, I've got this slide on the back as well. You might underline, because it doesn't show the highlight there, the ands, the three ands, and the then, because I'm going to contrast that with the other viewpoints. The objections to this viewpoint, well, the support for this viewpoint, it's a long-standing and somewhat traditional viewpoint. Many Jewish scholars as well as Christian scholars have held to this over time. This was the viewpoint of Luther and Calvin and the Reformers. And some of the older commentaries, Leupold, for example, Keil and Delitzsch, this is their viewpoint. And even the classic grammar, Gesenius, would hold to this view as well. The objections, it redefines the heaven and the earth, and actually views them independently, where God created heavens and earth distinct. The second objection is Isaiah 45:18. What this verse does as well is the problem with it is it makes God the author of whatever unformedness and other unfilledness is there, and the darkness that is there. God is the author of that. And other scholars see a problem with that in that it makes God the author of what they view as a negative, whereas this viewpoint would say, no, they're neutral terms, shouldn't you view them. In other words, to be consistent, they have to view them in a neutral way. Now, Isaiah 45:18 basically says, "For thus says the Lord, who created the heavens. He is the God who formed the earth and made it. He established it and did not create it a waste place," using the same word that we have in verse 2. And then it goes on and says other things. So it seems to be inconsistent with Isaiah 45:18. And God is not the author of chaos, which is the essential meaning of the word immediately at the beginning of verse 2. And instead it tells us that God, the other places tell us that God created all by his word. Psalm 33, one place, and there's other places as well. So that's the first view. Original creation and absolute beginning. A very popular view, in fact, probably many of you were raised with this view. It's called the restitution theory. You probably know it as the what theory?
Gap theory.
The gap theory. Very popular. In fact, Scofield's Bible, first edition, popularized this viewpoint. Now, this viewpoint, I think, is the least desirable of the three and has a lot of problems, grammatical as well as, from our perspective, it would have some scientific problems. It was an attempt, and I gave you this background, it was an attempt by those theologians that were intimidated by the geological science to somehow find how we might explain geology, and they put a gap in there. And in that gap, you can insert as many geological ages as you want. But I think this is a very, not only grammatically is a weak theory, but it doesn't help us at all in solving that issue of the geological record. And let me show you why. First of all, the restitution theory or the gap theory. We do have verse 1 as the original creation out of nothing. And inserted in that, theologically, it's not described there, but it's just inserted, putting other passages together, the fall of Satan, as described in either Isaiah 14 or Ezekiel 28, or both of them. Satan's sin, and as a result of that sin, well, we have the long gaps of time, so you insert the geological record in there. And then verse 2 describes the results after God judged the world for Satan's sin. Okay, so it puts the fall of Satan between an original creation and what follows in verse 3 as a recreation, where God recreates the heavens and the earth. Okay? If you want to look at it on a timeline, and again, I've got that slide and this slide on the back of your sheet there. So there is an original creation, much like the first view, out of nothing, but then you have this long gap, as I tried to illustrate with this point over here. You have this gap here, where you have the fall of Satan, and then you have a judgment of God, and then you have verse 2 that describes the unfilled and void, or condition that we have in verse 2. And then we have the recreation in verses 3 through 21. So you have a geological time gap in there. By putting geological formations there, introduces another theological problem.